Skyway Publishing presents the Epistle to the Hebrews. We've come to lesson number 13 in our study of the Epistle to the Hebrews. In lesson 12, we began to look at chapter number 11. Chapter 11 of Hebrews is that chapter which describes to us both by definition and by example the kind of faith that will hold us in Jesus Christ and prevent or at least discourage our turning away from Christ and following after other religious ideas. That was the theme of the Epistle to the Hebrews. Many of the Hebrew Christians, those who had followed the Old Testament law, had turned back to Moses, forsaking Christ, going back to some of the physical activities that they had known all of their lives. And others were tempted to do so. And so the letter was written to, number one, discourage them from turning back, and number two, to give them good reasons that a person should not do so. In the process of that, of course, he has given us an excellent analysis of the theme of the whole Bible, how the New Testament relates to the Old Testament, how the two work together. And we understand how that Christ is the fulfillment of the Old Testament law and the prophets and all the history. And Christ is the ultimate plan of God. The gospel that we have today is what God has given to the world to last for all time. Well, in lesson number 12, we looked at verses 1 through 5 of Hebrews chapter 11. We saw in the first three verses the definition, and in verses 4 and 5 the beginnings of some examples of faith. And we pick up at this point and look at the longer list of those examples of faith. In verse number 6, without faith it is impossible to please him, that is, to please God. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. The goal of man's faith, from man's perspective, I suppose, is eternal salvation. But it pleases God when we believe in him. A man without faith simply cannot please God. There is no eternal value in being, for example, a good citizen or a popular public person. Men praise their friends, their neighbors, the Hollywood or movie heroes, the sports heroes, the political heroes. And when one of them dies, folks will say, well, surely a good person like that will go to heaven. There's no spiritual value in that by itself. Those characteristics will not get a person into heaven. The praise of men gets no soul into heaven. No man comes to the Father except by faith in Jesus as the Christ, as he himself said in chapter 14 of John in verse number 6. So in the ancients, what was it that pleased God? Let's look at the examples. Verse number 7. By faith, Noah, being warned of God of things not seen as yet, moved with fear, prepared an ark to the saving of his house, by the which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is by faith. Now, this sentence doesn't say that Noah moved from one place to another. What it says is that his fear, his respect, his reverence, his awe of God motivated him, caused him to act, to take action. It was his faith that condemned the world, but it was his visible actions that gave evidence of that faith. And that, of course, is the case throughout this list of examples and throughout the Bible. James, of course, you remember in chapter 2, had a rather lengthy discussion of the connection between faith and works. There are people who believe that works have no part in our salvation, that we're saved by faith only. James had a different opinion. In verse 18 of chapter 2 of his short epistle, he said, a man may say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that there's one God. You do well, but the devils also believe and tremble. As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also. That last is from verse number 20. How do you show someone that you have faith if it is not by works? How can I know that you have faith other than by what I see in your behavior? Does your faith move you to do what is instructed by the one in whom you have faith? Here's another example. By faith, Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed. And he went out not knowing whither he went. But by faith he sojourned in the land of promise as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked for a city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. When we read Genesis chapter 12, the beginning of the record of Abraham and God's call to come into a new land, we don't see that Abraham did not know where he was going. That isn't really clear in the text of Genesis chapter 12. But here it's clearly revealed to us by the Holy Spirit. Abraham didn't even know where he was going. God said, come to a land that I will show you. It is as God said, Abraham, start down the road. I'll tell you when to stop. And Abraham simply got up and followed. This observation makes it more meaningful to us when we read the statement of Genesis 15:6, that Abraham believed in the Lord and he counted it to him for righteousness. Righteousness, you see, is that quality of faith, of belief, of action, of living according to our faith, following after the instructions of God that take us where we want to go. Abraham trusted God to lead him to a home chosen and prepared by God himself. Ur, where Abraham had lived in the land of the Chaldees, was a great city with fine houses. For 3 generations, Abraham's family lived in tents in a foreign land. It was indeed a great example of faith or trust in God to leave such a home and go into such a wilderness existence. Didn't even know where he was going, but he went simply because God told him to go. Abraham is put forth to us as an example, and an example is illustrated for us or given to us with the implication that we're supposed to follow, copy that example. Through faith, also Sarah herself received strength to conceive seed and was delivered of a child when she was past age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Therefore sprang there even one, and him as good as dead, so many as the stars of the sky in multitude, and as the sand which is by the seashore innumerable. Well, not much is said to us in the Old Testament about Sarah's faith, but here we learn that the reason that she was able to give birth long after her childbearing years, or normal natural childbearing years, is that she trusted God to keep his promise. In Genesis chapter 18, Abraham and Sarah, beginning in verse 11, Abraham and Sarah were old and well stricken in age, and it ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I am waxed old shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also. And the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I of surety bear a child which am old? Is there anything too hard for the Lord? At the time appointed I will return to thee according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. And she did. We're told here because she had such faith in God. She didn't know how God was going to keep his promise. So at one time she had offered a plan by which she thought she was going to help God keep the promise that he had given to Abraham. Back in chapter 16, Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had a handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And Sarah said to Abram, behold, now the Lord has restrained me from bearing. I pray thee go into my maid, that it may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abraham hearkened to the voice of Sarah, and Sarah, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. Well, that was man's plan. That wasn't God's plan. God had made a promise in Genesis chapter 12, we can read. Come out of your home, away from your father's house, out of your land, and go to a land that I will show you, and I will make you a blessing to all the world. I'll give you a land and many descendants. The Apostle Paul makes a strong argument on faith by contrasting Sarah's plan with God's plan, and you can read that in Galatians chapter 4. But in Hebrews chapter 11, here in verse number 13, we read that these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For they that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country. And truly, if they had been mindful of that country from whence they came out, they might have had opportunity to have returned. But now they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they owned no land in Palestine. They were strangers, they were foreigners, they were pilgrims. They weren't looking for possessions and permanence in this world, but they wanted to dwell wherever God would bless them. That's why God is not ashamed to be called their God. And he calls himself their God in Exodus chapter 3 and verse number 6. He said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, and he was afraid to look upon God. When he realized this eternal, all-powerful creator who had known Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Adam before that, who had created all this world, was now speaking directly to Moses. That understanding, that realization ought to cause us all to tremble and to hide our faces from God. Continue in verse number 17, still with Abraham. Look at all of his examples of faith. Over and over, he was consistent in showing his faith in God. Verse 17, by faith, Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac, and he that had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said that in Isaac shall thy seed be called, accounting that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from whence also he received him in a figure. The record here is from Genesis, or the references to Genesis chapter 22 and verse number 5. You know, Abraham was called to go sacrifice Isaac up on the mountain in Moriah. And as they went, you remember that Isaac said, Father, we've got the wood and we've got the fire, but where's the lamb for the offering? And Abraham said to him, the Lord himself will provide a lamb. On the way up, they had taken servants with them, and Abraham told the servants, you stay here. He said, I and the lad will go yonder and worship and come again to you. That confidence that he had, that he and the lad were going up, even though God had told him to sacrifice the lad, that shows the faith of Abraham. Abraham was fully persuaded to do what God had told him to do. Trusting in God to fulfill the promise to give him descendants through Isaac, God was ready to sacrifice Isaac because he believed that, well, Isaac is going to be a father. If I kill him now, that means God's going to raise him up again. Abraham had never seen anybody raised from the dead, but he had that kind of faith in God. Figuratively, then, when he walked back down from the mountain, it was to Abraham as if he had received Isaac back from the grave. In his own mind, Isaac was dead and God had raised him up. He had put Isaac to death in his mind because God told him to. And he knew that he was coming back with Isaac. So it was as if he had received him, figuratively, received him back from the grave. And then we turn to Isaac in verse number 20. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. God had obviously told Isaac what the future held for his two sons. You know, when we were talking about Abel, by faith offering a more excellent sacrifice, verse number 4 in our previous lesson, we said that that was only possible because God had told him what to offer. In Romans chapter 10, faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God, verse number 17. But Abel had faith. We don't see in Genesis that God told them what to offer as a sacrifice, but we understand from Romans chapter 10 that in fact God had done so. The same must be true here in the case of Isaac blessing Jacob and Esau. In Genesis chapter 27, we have the record of this blessing that Isaac gave to Jacob. God give thee the dew of heaven, the fatness of the earth, and plenty of corn and wine. Let people serve thee, and nations bow down to thee. Be Lord over thy brethren, and let thy mother's sons bow down to thee. Cursed be every one that curses thee, and blessed be he that blesseth thee. And then to Esau he gave this blessing. Behold, thy dwelling shall be the fatness of the earth, and the dew of heaven. And by thy sword shalt thou live, shalt serve thy brother. And it shall come to pass when thou shalt have the dominion that thou shalt break his yoke from off his neck. Verses 39 and 40. Verse 21, by faith Jacob, when he was a-dying, blessed both the sons of Joseph, and worshipped leaning upon his staff. Even to the time of such great age and infirmity that he was leaning upon the top of his staff, Jacob kept his faith in God and spoke to his grandsons accordingly. That's recorded in Genesis chapter 48. Verse 5 says, And now your two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, which were born unto you in the land of Egypt, before I came to Egypt, they're mine. As Reuben and Simeon, they shall be mine. And then he blessed all the other sons that had preceded him in Egypt. And in verse number 33 of chapter 49, when Jacob had made an end of commanding his sons, he gathered up his feet into the bed and yielded up the ghost and was gathered to his people. Right at the end of his life, as he was dying, he blessed those boys. And if you go read chapters 48 and 49, you can see the prophecies of their lives and what those tribes were going to be like when they were settled in their promised land. By faith, verse 22, Joseph, when he died, made mention of the departing of the children of Israel and gave commandment concerning his bones. God had told Abraham that his descendants would be in another land until the fourth generation, Genesis 15 and verse 16. Joseph believed the word of God, and he made plans accordingly, even in his final will. In Genesis chapter 50, and beginning in verse 24, Joseph said to his brethren, I die, and God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land unto the land which he sware to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and ye shall carry up my bones from hence. He believed the promise, and he made arrangements for living according to the promise, and for his heirs to live according to the promise. Verse 23. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents because they saw he was a proper child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandment. This is not the faith of Moses, of course, but the faith of his parents. They loved their child. They saw some quality in him that was different from others. They were not afraid of the king, the command to kill all the boy babies that were born. They had respect to common decency. They opposed such murder. And they had faith in God such that they were not even afraid of the murderous dictator before them. The record is in Exodus chapter 2 and verse 2. They hid him for 3 months, just as it's said here. In verse 24, by faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Moses had been adopted, you remember, by the daughter of Pharaoh. His parents had hid him, and then they hid him in a river in a basket. And Pharaoh's daughter found him and adopted him as her own. But when he grew up, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. He paid attention to what God had promised to the faithful, and to him that was more valuable than all the treasures in Egypt. This faith of Moses is a striking message to our modern materialistic world. His faith in God was such that he could give up the privileges, the pleasures of the palace, and choose instead to stand with God's people, even though they were being persecuted to the death. They were slaves and were being beaten and forced to hard labor. Moses could have been possibly the next Pharaoh of Egypt. Certainly would have been a high-ranking official or advisor to the next Pharaoh, if nothing else. His motivation for leaving all of that and standing instead with Israel, God's promise of the final reward. People today who are tempted by the lure of the beautiful and amazing things that we see advertised or that somebody else has or that we find in the stores would do well to look again at the example of the life of Moses. Here is what pleased God: standing with the people of God, even if it means giving up worldly pleasures and treasures, prestige, a name and power. Moses gave up all of that. God gave him back more of it than Pharaoh had. We don't even know the name of the Pharaoh who lived during the time of Moses. Commentators and historians argue about just when all this occurred. But we know Moses, and we know how long he lived, and we know where he died, and we know what he did all through his life, and the major work that he did that influenced the whole world, because he stood with God. Verse 27, by faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who was invisible. After all the 10 plagues, Pharaoh was very angry with Moses and Aaron and with all of the Israelites. But Moses led the people out overnight because God told him to, even while Pharaoh's son was dying. And Pharaoh was going to persecute and pursue after the Israelites. Moses wasn't afraid of the king. He went on out of Egypt, leading toward the promised land, as God had told him to do. His faith was so certain that it was as if he could even see the God whose word he followed. Seeing him who is invisible, the writer says. Not literally, but understanding the reality of God. Up until this time, Moses had not seen God physically, and when he did, it was only his backside. He had heard God's voice. He had seen the burning bush. He'd seen the miracles that God worked in the plagues. He hadn't seen God personally, but his faith was such that it was as if he had seen him. Through faith, he kept the Passover, that is the first Passover, that night in which God passed over the houses of the Israelites. Through faith, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them. Exodus chapter 12, all the way through that chapter, the description of killing the lamb, sprinkling the blood on the door, and God says, when I see the blood, I will pass over you. That's why the celebration of that day is referred to as the Passover. Verse number 29. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, which the Egyptians, trying to do, were drowned. They'd been standing on the bank of the sea. The army was bearing down upon them from behind. They feared for their lives, and they were ready to surrender to the army. Exodus chapter 14, verses 10 and following. When Pharaoh drew nigh, the children of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them, and they were sore afraid. And the children of Israel cried out to the Lord, and they said to Moses, Because there were no graves in Egypt, hast thou taken us to die in the wilderness? Wherefore hast thou dealt with us to carry us forth out of Egypt? Is not this the word that we did tell thee in Egypt, saying, Let us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? It had been better for us to serve the Egyptians than that we should die in the wilderness. They were ready to turn back to Egypt rather than to suffer the threat of the army. But the sea opened up. The water stood up as walls on both sides of them, a dry path on the floor to cross to the other side. Is it natural for a crowd of about 1 million people to walk into that path, not fearing that the walls of water might collapse up on them at any moment? What's holding that water up there? Wouldn't we be afraid to walk into that? Wouldn't it be better maybe just to turn around and surrender to the Egyptians? But they walked in. And why did they do that? Faith in God, who promised to save them from their enemy. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse number 7 says, We walk by faith and not by sight. Verse number 30 brings us along a little bit through history, and we find that by faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they were compassed about 7 days. The description of that is in Joshua chapter 6. Beginning in verse 13, 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord went on continually and blew with the trumpets, and the armed men went before them, but the rearward came after the ark of the Lord, and the priests going on and blowing with trumpets. And the 2nd day they compassed the city once and returned into the camp, and so did they 6 days. It came to pass on the 7th day that they rose early about the dawning of the day and compassed the city after the same manner 7 times. Only on that day they compassed the city 7 times. And it came to pass at the 7th time, when the priests blew with the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, Shout, for the Lord hath given you the city. So the people shouted when the priests blew with the trumpets, and it came to pass, when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, and the people shouted with a great shout, that the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city. Walk around the city in silence once a day for 6 days. On the 7th day, walk around it 7 times, blow the trumpets, and shout. Will that make the walls of a city fall down? Well, not likely. But it did. The walls did fall down. It wasn't the walking, of course. It wasn't the trumpeting. It wasn't the shouting that brought down those walls. It was the power of God that was exercised before them because they had done what he had commanded them to do. And it was their faith that brought him to obey him. When they did what God said do, they got the reward that they were seeking. That's an illustration of faith. Another illustration comes from Jericho, verse number 31. By faith the harlot Rahab perished not with them that believed not, when she had received the spies with peace. In the 2nd chapter of Joshua, we find record of the introduction to Rahab. Joshua had sent out spies. They had come to her house, and she said to them, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that your terror is fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land faint because of you. For we've heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites that were on the other side Jordan. And as soon as we had heard these things, our hearts did melt, neither did there remain any more courage in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and in earth beneath. She had faith in God. She understood the power of God, the existence of God, and she believed. She behaved peaceably toward God's people, hiding the spies from their enemies, even from her own people, because she believed in God more than in her nation, more than in the leaders of her nation, the personalities involved, even the laws of man that governed her. Even though she was not a descendant of Abraham, who had received the promise, but was a citizen of the nation being destroyed because of its sin, she was saved because she individually, irrespective of those among whom she had lived, she had faith in God. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, again, Paul says, we're all going to be judged individually. We must all stand before the judgment seat of Christ, that every one may receive the things done in his body according to that he hath done, whether it be good or bad. The crowning lesson from these examples is that, as faithful as they were, none of them received the promised blessing that God spoke to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. With less evidence than we have, and a lesser blessing, they nevertheless set the standard of faith in God that we must meet today. We'll look at the other examples that are only briefly summarized in our next lesson. Thank you for studying with this Confirming the Churches program produced by Skyway Publishing. Confirming the Churches exists to encourage and assist churches to adhere to the original teaching of the apostles of Jesus Christ regarding the organization, doctrine, worship, and work of all churches everywhere. Study guides, books, tracts, and essays in print and online, as well as audio and video productions on disc and online, are employed to this end. All are free of charge in the English language and in some other languages to mission churches around the world. To request the lessons of your choice or an in-person seminar with our evangelists and teachers, please see our listings and information at www.skywavepub.org or call toll-free in the U.S. and Canada to 844-650-3223. May God bless you today.